Hello to everybody slowly but surely joining us for today's event. It's the 17th of September, Tuesday. Wherever you're listening from in the world to this event, welcome aboard. Our hosts today are the European Consumer Organization and ClientEarth. And I'm sure you already know the topic for this event because you signed up for it and turned up for it. But we're going to be talking about flying away from greenwashing in the aviation sector, of course. Now, your normal, I think, Brussels-centric EU policy events are normally a standard affair, especially in September, and especially when there's a new European Commission about to be unveiled, where different voices share their different views on various issues and topics. But today we're going to be doing it slightly differently, a little bit more unique, and we're going to be looking at the scientific basis behind today's issue, as well as hearing from civil society leaders about greenwashing and different claims that are being made against the airline industry. Now, of course, this was all kicked off in 2023. We'll be hearing much more about the background to the case of greenwashing that is currently ongoing. We're going to be hearing from various experts about that, the background to it, what the future holds, and of course, the wider issue of greening and cleaning up aviation. So, of course, stay tuned throughout the event. You'll actually be given a chance to ask your own questions towards the end. If you have any questions for our experts that haven't been raised by myself or the panelists themselves, then please do pop it into the chat box. And if we have time and if it's interesting enough, I'll pose it to one of the panel. So bear that in mind. I'll remind you in a bit as well. Now, I'm, of course, not the expert here. I'm just here to hopefully facilitate the conversation and deliver the information to you, audience at home. So we better ask for our hosts to actually give us some extra details about what we're talking about today and more details about that case that I mentioned. And we've got representatives from the European Consumer Organization and ClientEarth, our hosts, as I mentioned, to give us some more details and to set the scene in a bit more detail about what we're going to be talking about today. I'd like to welcome Pauline Constant and Jonathan White from Consumer Organization and ClientEarth, respectively. Pauline, let's start off with you. Tell us what we're talking about today.
Thanks a lot, Sam. Thank you very much. I will ask you all to think about the last time you were browsing for plane tickets. And chances are, I'm sure that you were offered to go either CO2 neutral or to fly green, for instance. And it may surely have provided you with some peace of mind. But when consumer organizations noticed that these offers were available all across Europe, it really set off our greenwashing radar. So that's why we analyzed such claims, and we found out that basically they amounted to an unfair commercial practice. So because for us, there is no such thing as sustainable flying. So that's why with 24 BEUC members from our network, we launched a complaint to the network of national consumer protection authorities last year, as Sam was explaining. Because for consumers, greenwashing is very problematic, especially at a time when consumers want to protect the climate and want to live more sustainably. But how can they do so if they are lured by misleading green marketing? Last year, we also polled a representative sample of consumers from 16 countries, and it came out very clearly that consumers are increasingly frustrated with greenwashing. For instance, they cannot easily tell between a false and a genuine claim. So if you take, for instance, a claim such as CO2 neutral that you can see quite often on airlines' websites, if you think about this one, just know that 9 in 10 consumers think that the companies selling carbon neutral products are required by the law to compensate those CO2 emissions. But I'm sorry to break it, there are no such laws obliging them to do so. So such misleading practices are harmful for consumers, they are harmful for the environment, and they're also harmful for the trust that consumers have that they can have in the genuinely sustainable claims. And importantly, our survey showed that consumers are counting on the policymakers to act and also to protect them against greenwashing. So for such an important topic, it is really important to have robust scientific evidence and also expert insights. So that's why we're here today. And with our partner ClientEarth, we're very happy to welcome our speakers who are all experts in either aviation or sustainability or both. So thank you all for being here and enjoy the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks for that great scene setting, Pauline. I remember talking to you about this earlier in the year when all of this was sort of making headlines, and it's great to see that momentum kind of continuing now and consumers still being given that opportunity to actually see their rights protected and even improved. Jonathan, hand it over to you now for a bit more detail about what we're talking about today from sort of like the legal perspective of this and how this came about. Give us a little bit more details about today's topic.
Yeah, sure. And it's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you, everyone, for coming. So ClientEarth is obviously an environmental legal NGO. It works on the administration of justice connected with the protection of the environment. And it might seem a little odd for an environmental legal organization to be involved with consumer protection, but actually the basic rule against misleading practices is really crucially important for making progress on environmental crises that we face. And the reason for this is quite simple. If we don't have accurate information on the causes and the solutions to climate change, then we won't address those causes, and we definitely won't take up those solutions. And instead, what we will have is developing market failure, which will be unfortunately followed by ecosystem failure. What we've seen in our work is that a small number of industries that are heavily invested in the highest polluting activities spend very large sums on promoting false or exaggerated solutions. And what they're doing is it's a bid to delay and divert transition away from their business models. Unfortunately, the effects of this are real. The effects are seen in the air we breathe and in the increasing danger that our climate poses to people. The legal action against aviation industry green claims has now gone through the courts, with KLM found by a panel of Dutch judges to have made a range of misleading and therefore unlawful claims. And now, as we all know, it's going through the EU regulators network. And what we hoped this session would really do is to hone in on a key part of the legal test to which airlines will have to meet. And they're required under the law to substantiate their advertising claims, which means that they have to provide evidence to back them up, to show that they're not duping people and to show that the claims can be trusted. I wanted actually to point to a small part of the Commission's guidance on consumer protection law, which explains how this works. So the evidence that advertisers have to provide to put behind environmental claims has to be, and I quote, robust, independent, verifiable, and generally recognized evidence, which takes into account updated scientific findings and methods. The guidance says the evidence has to be clear and it has to be robust. If, for example, experts actually disagree, then the trader should refrain from the claim entirely. So in short, to be trustworthy, environmental claims require pretty good environmental evidence. And as I speak today, the regulators within the CPC-Network at the European level are going to be considering if the airlines have met this test. So today, what we're hoping to do is to shine a bit of a light into the precedent-setting regulatory action that is going on and hear from a range of experts on exactly that evidence as a sort of insight into the regulatory process and hopefully some assistance to it as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. I think that's a great context for the panel that we're going to be having now. And we have 5 great experts to actually shine that light that you mentioned on what we're talking about here. And I'll introduce them now, and they're going to be giving us their views on this and answering questions. And as I mentioned to everyone at home, if you do have questions, put them in the chat box and we'll try to get to them later. So I'll introduce everyone now and then turn the floor over to each of them to give us their views. In no particular order. First off, we have Derek Broekhoff from the Stockholm Environment Institute. Welcome, Derek. We also have Clemens Kauper from the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. Welcome to you as well, Clemens. Finley Asher from Safe Landing, a group that advocates for just transition in aviation. Finley's actually experiencing a bit of transport woes at the moment, so he might be joining a little bit later, but he will be here eventually. Hiske Arts is our other expert panelist from Fossielvrij. And last but not least, Erin Vera from Transport and Environment. Now, each of you are going to get the opportunity to give us your thoughts on what we're talking about today, greenwashing, how this case has come about, the scientific basis for it, of course, as well. And I guess we'll start off with Derek from Stockholm Environment Institute. Derek, over to you for your views on this, your take, and what you have to say about flying away from greenwashing.
Yeah, okay, thank you. First of all, I hope you all can hear me.
We can indeed, yes.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sam, and thank you for the opportunity to be here and speak on this issue today. I guess, to kind of set out my view on things, I guess, number one, it's better to take action on climate change than to not take action on climate change, all else equal, right? So if you're looking at a carbon offsetting offering from a company, if you have that option to tick the box and fund something that might help to mitigate climate change, in general, that's a good idea. But I say all else equal, and there are a couple of caveats around this, of course, because there's this issue of unintended consequences. So greenwashing or not greenwashing, I won't necessarily opine on that. Greenwashing, I think, often implies an intention to mislead, and I'm not sure that's always the case when we're talking about carbon offsetting. But there are maybe three things to be concerned about. Now, oftentimes when we're talking about carbon crediting and carbon offsets, the greenwashing concern has to do with what you could call the quality of the carbon offsets or these carbon credits. That is, do they actually represent real climate change mitigation, either avoided emissions or removals of CO2 from the atmosphere? That's what they're supposed to represent, but there's an abundant amount of evidence suggesting that oftentimes these credits do not represent real avoided emissions. For example, the credits are going to pay for things that would have happened anyway, so they're not actually resulting in any additional benefit, or the emission reductions are over quantified, so on and so forth. That is an issue, and it's something that needs to be paid careful attention to. But I also think it's a solvable issue. Again, while there is a lot of concern with poor quality in the carbon offset market, there are also a number of initiatives that are directly working to address those quality issues, and regulators in many jurisdictions looking at trying to ensure quality. So things like the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Markets, there are a number of carbon credit rating agencies. I think we need to encourage any company that is looking to invest in carbon credits, maybe offer them to their customers, to seek out the high quality credits. And I think, again, that's mostly a solvable issue. When it comes to greenwashing, and in particular instances where companies are offering carbon neutral products or services, or offering to make a certain activity carbon neutral, my concerns lie elsewhere. And those concerns really have to do with how this carbon neutrality claim is represented to consumers. So there are two issues here that I think are interrelated. The first is simply that I think a lot of consumers, when they see a carbon neutral label, don't fully understand what that means. And there's a big risk there, because I think oftentimes a consumer seeing a carbon neutral claim, say associated with flying, interpret that to mean that the activity, like flying, has no environmental impact on a net basis. So it's equivalent to taking a flight with zero emissions. And that is not the case. But the problem is, if consumers understand that to be the case, they may feel no compunction about engaging in an activity that is actually bad for the climate, right? So there's a number of surveys suggesting that consumers may not fully appreciate the difference between carbon neutral and zero emissions. There's at least one peer-reviewed study. It's a small case, but at a youth hostel in Germany, there was an experiment done where half the guests were told that the showers would be offset with carbon offsets. They'd be carbon neutral. The other half were not. And the half that were told that they had carbon neutral showers actually took longer showers, right? And that's exactly what we don't want to happen. Not clear how much you can extrapolate that to other things, but I think you probably can, right? So that's an issue. If it's something like green steel, right? Green steel is very expensive. If you have a conventional producer of steel that's simply offsetting their emissions, and they can do so more cheaply than simply decarbonizing their operations. And then we have people buying more steel that's produced with fossil fuels. Again, that's going to lock in emissions over the long run that we don't want to see. So there's these perverse or unintended outcomes that we need to avoid. The second concern I have, and I'll wrap up, is maybe a bit more conceptual, but it's simply that, if you have an activity, flying may be an example, that is simply not aligned with a world that is on its way to limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, right? So if you think about the world collectively taking action to address climate change consistent with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, if you have an activity that would be out of sort of off track with that trajectory, then offsetting that activity does not all of a sudden bring it back onto that 1.5 degree pathway, right? You have two options, A and B. It's not like they're both equal. If one is the optimal path, then taking path B, offsetting those emissions, doesn't all of a sudden get you back onto the optimal path. And so it's very important to convey to consumers that if there's an activity that is not sustainable, that offsetting is a second best solution. It's not going to just compensate for the impact of that flight in terms of keeping us on the pathway that we need to be on. So better to do something on climate change than not, all else equal, but not all else is equal. And it's very important for companies to clearly communicate what offsetting actually means and that it is this second best option in many cases.
At that point you made about the differences between climate neutral, net zero, zero emissions, it's something that I struggled with as a journalist when all of these terms were first being used and almost interchangeably by a lot of people. And it almost seems like that was by design sometimes to actually create confusion in times, but using the right terminology, very important. Just a reminder to our audience, we've had questions starting to come in. If you could maybe just add to the end of your question who you are and who you work for, where you're coming from, that would help us give extra context for the people that we're asking. Moving on to our next panelist, we have Clémence Kauper, who actually did the legal analysis, I do believe, for BEUC and the complaint. Maybe, Clémence, you could start off by giving us your viewpoint on this, obviously, and maybe telling us what the most striking example or the striking elements from the analysis that sort of jumped out at you. What were the things that maybe shocked you or, interested you the most? And 4 or 5 minutes, over to you.
All right, thanks so much. Thanks for having me. So maybe the first thing that struck me was that airlines indeed communicate quite extensively about the sustainability issues and specifically about the climate. What I did is I assessed the legality of these claims under the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, which is the relevant legal act on consumer protection, which is then implemented into national law. And the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive essentially prohibits advertisers to communicate to consumers in ways that are either factually incorrect or otherwise deceptive, and this communication must have the potential to influence consumer behavior. What's important to know about the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive is that it requires the advertiser to support the claims they make. So in essence, you can sum it up as if you make marketing claims about the climate, you need to be able to prove that they're true. So climate-related marketing claims by the advertising industry, they come in all shapes and colors, but I found that they, in essence, fall into one of three groups. And the first type of claims is that flying can be, we already heard it, carbon neutral, or that the emissions are offset or compensated. The second type of claim is about alternative aviation fuels such as biofuels, and claims that these are sustainable. And the third type of claims are more general, that flying is or can be green or sustainable, or in relative terms greener, more sustainable, less CO2. Overall, my finding was that all of these advertisings falling into these three case groups have a very high potential of deceiving consumers, and are therefore liable to be prohibited under the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive. And maybe just a few words on why this is the case. Carbon neutrality claims are, as we heard, relying on carbon credits, right? Carbon credits are supposed to offset the emissions from flying. The problem is, as we already heard, is that they often don't work, or that their effects are at least more uncertain than the climate effects of emissions. And an uncertain effect cannot offset a certain harm to the climate. And therefore, carbon neutrality claims are factually incorrect and thus misleading for consumers. And this has already been found by a number of courts in Europe. Maybe a second word on alternative aviation fuels, biofuels, synthetic fuels, which are often called sustainable aviation fuels. The problem here is that climate science is very clear that every additional emission of CO2 or other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere contributes to global warming, which means that, what does sustainability mean in the climate context? It means ending greenhouse gas emissions. Alternative aviation fuels typically have less emissions than fossil-based aviation fuels, but their emissions are not zero. Consequently, you cannot argue that they are sustainable in that way. And even if we look at sustainable in a broader sense, then it must be said that these alternative aviation fuels have very high resource requirements, for example, land use requirements, and you just cannot scale them up to the necessary amount in a completely sustainable way. So these sustainability claims about alternative aviation fuels are also misleading. So maybe I'll wrap this one up. My finding was that all of these communications about aviation communications about the climates have a high potential to mislead consumers, and therefore my recommendation is that the aviation industry abstains from making sustainability and climate-related communications altogether. Thanks.
Thanks, Clémence. We actually had just to give people like a peer behind the curtain of how journalism is done, we had a discussion not so long ago, myself and my colleagues, about whether or not we should use the term sustainable aviation fuel, and we actually said that alternative aviation fuels would be a more accurate way to call them. So I think anybody listening out there in the audience, maybe it's, you can make a small change by using that terminology instead of sustainable aviation fuels. Just my thoughts. Moving on to our next panelist, of course, we have Hiske Arts from Fossielvrij. Hiske, turning to you now. Back in March 2024, which is this year, it seems like a long time ago, the Dutch court said that KLM's green advertising breached consumer law, and your organization was a big part of that complaint. Maybe you could tell us about that case, how you won, how did you wrangle all of the different expert opinions about this? And yeah, do you see it as perhaps a template for other groups to do the same against other airlines in different parts of the world? Over to you. 4 or 5 minutes for your views on what we're talking about today.
Okay, thank you for this invitation. After our win at the KLM greenwashing case, I believe it's now up to the regulators and lawmakers. So it's really great to be here in this audience. So I will take you back on our journey. We first joined a complaint at the Dutch advertising watchdog against KLM, which we won. And in this, KLM claimed, "Be a hero, fly CO2 zero." And the Dutch advertising watchdog indeed said this was misleading. But then we noticed, like we noticed before, that KLM would just make some tweaks, but kept the essence of the advertising that remained the same. So we felt like we had to get away from the advertising watchdog to the real court and to get a decision with more repercussions. So this is when our KLM lawsuit started. We first sent a letter to KLM to warn them to stop making misleading ads and told them we would go to court if they did not withdraw the misleading green advertisements. And this led first to a conversation with KLM in the office, but it felt like they were not taking us seriously at all. And this meant that we started our court case against KLM. And then later on, we had a second conversation with KLM, like after we handed in our writ, and they invited us again, I think, trying to get the case off the table. And I think this was also the moment when KLM started to realize that we were not bluffing and we really would continue with the court case. And KLM offered to make some changes to the text, but refused again to change the core message of the marketing. And its core marketing is that KLM was still painting a very rosy picture of the climate impact of traveling with KLM, and even saying that people would contribute to reaching the Paris goals by flying with KLM, as KLM was committed to the goals of the Paris Agreement. And I think we all know that buying a long distance flight is one of the most polluting things an individual can do. And in reality, KLM is even planning to grow. And this growth leads to a growth of emissions and thus deepens the climate crisis. And what the other speakers were talking about, KLM was also still advertising that the impact of a flight can be reduced or even neutralized by buying CO2 offsets. So basically the messaging stayed the same, and they were willing to change some sentences, but this was not enough for us. So we decided to go ahead with the court case, and it took us like 1.5 years, but then eventually we won. The judges ruled that KLM misled consumers in 15 of its environmental statements. And what it was a pity to us that the judge did not order a ban for similar claims in the future. And this means, again, that KLM can just take away these specific claims, but other comparable ones are still up. For example, alternative fuels, which they call more sustainable aviation fuels. This term can still be found on their website. And this means we are still stuck. We're still stuck in a cat and mouse game in which we either can go back to court, but it's a game where we are always on the losing end because the harm has been done when people see the advertisements. So we as climate organization or as consumer organizations will always be too late when we bring this up. It is important that we do it, but we need something better. And we think that airlines are not going to stop this marketing because this is their license to grow. They need it for their growth. And this makes it so important that regulators will step up and impose fines on airlines so that not consumers have to go after these airlines one by one. And of course, we need a ban on fossil fuel ads because if we had this ban, we wouldn't even have this conversation.
Looking forward to the second half of the Q&A session, Hiske, because I wanted to ask you about something that's happened in the Hague in the last week or so about banning fossil fuels and the link with what we're talking about today. So we'll come back to that. Thank you so much for your background on the case. Sorry to hear that it's been pushing a boulder up the hill, and hopefully this case that we're talking about today will be, should we say, a sea change in a way in how this issue is actually approached in the legal system. We'll move on now to Erin Vera from Transport and Environment. Erin, thanks for joining us today. I guess let's pick up a little bit on what Hiske and Clement said about sustainable aviation fuels, alternative aviation fuels. What's your take on that kind of aspect of what we're talking about today? Is this something that we're betting on too much? Are airlines putting too many of their eggs in this particular basket? Yeah, 4 or 5 minutes over to you for your views on greenwashing in the aviation sector.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you, BEUC, for inviting me. So, are we betting too much in sustainable aviation fuels or in alternative fuels? The short answer to that is maybe yes. It is important to develop cleaner fuels, but the truth is that nowadays, until 2030, we know that the estimations are that technologies or cleaner fuels are not going to be ready at scale before 2030. So actually, nowadays, the best way to reduce aviation emissions is basically two ways: is stopping the growth of aviation and reducing demand. How can we do that? The transparent environment, we think that the most important thing is to stop making aviation to grow by stopping airport expansions, because actually, when you expand airports, you are implying that aviation activity should grow. This is the one thing. And the second thing is to try reducing flying. Actually, I work specifically in the Travel Smart campaign that is led by Transparent Environment. And we're actually calling to companies to reduce business flying, because it is estimated that 30%, more or less 30% of flying emissions in Europe are associated to business flying. So in short, there are a range of measures that we should take in general to reduce aviation emissions. And it is not only relying on cleaner technologies or cleaner fuels that are not yet ready at scale, but rather a combination of both. So while, or in the meantime, while you develop and try to invest in the development of cleaner fuels and clear technologies, you have also to make or to try to reduce emissions that we are currently doing. And this can only be done by flying less.
Now, the behavior change that you mentioned is I guess, also so important to actually solving this problem, right? And yeah, I can see that it's going to be a lot of hard work to convince people, but that appears more and more clear that that's the way that we need to go. Our last panelist, before we get into the second half of the Q&A, where we'll go into more detail about what our experts have said here, is Finley Asher, who's managed to join us. He's from Safe Landing, a group that advocates for a just transition in aviation. Finley, thanks for joining us. Just to get your views on what we're talking about today, greenwashing in aviation. Maybe you want to talk about the alternative aviation fuels topic that we just went into with Aaron. Are they the real deal in your view? And do you think that maybe the worries outweigh the potential benefits? 4 or 5 minutes, again, to wrap up this part, your views on what we're talking about today.
Great, thanks for having me. And I think this is a really, really important conversation. I'm an aerospace engineer. My group, Safe Landing, is for aviation workers, both that have left the sector, but also lots of our community are still in the sector. They're pilots, cabin crew, aerospace engineers, air traffic controllers, airline, airport workers, factory workers. So from a worker perspective here, a lot of people in our community have been pilots that over the tannoy, over the announcement in the aircraft have said, like, this flight today has been CO2 neutral or carbon neutral, or they've handed out menus to people in their seat pockets in the aircraft that don't just show you the food that you can buy, but also talk about all the sustainability initiatives around carbon offsetting, alternative fuels, even just recycling plastic from waste or food waste on the aircraft. So there's a lot of sort of deception from the industry that we often actually feel really uncomfortable about as workers, being involved with that and being associated with it. But the other element is there's a real self-interest thing here from the industry. We are aviation workers. We love flying. We love air travel. We love the benefits it brings. But we're really concerned that we're going to lose the ability to fly because we've blown our carbon budget. Climate breakdown is accelerating, and it's just impossible to fly unless it's a necessity and essential. So we need policy discussions. And while we're discussing sort of consumers here, it's worthwhile remembering that politicians and policymakers also are exposed to these adverts, and they're exposed through their constituents through the people who vote them in that have been exposed to this. And it's, from our perspective, it's also preventing policy discussions like we need specific policies to get aviation on a climate neutral pathway. That isn't happening at the moment because there's a lot of disinformation, misinformation, and distraction around that are delaying that. And that's fundamental, that's so important. So yes, all of these topics, I mean, also things that haven't been mentioned, the industry talks about efficiency improvements, it talks about electric or hydrogen aircraft that just simply aren't going to be ready in time in the next 10 years, and the next 10 years is vital. Alternative fuels and carbon offsetting are the most prominent because they're the cheapest and they're the most technologically feasible. But absolutely, it's a problem with scale and resource availability in terms of land, in terms of biomass waste or electricity. And when you just look at the numbers, you know, I'm an engineer, it's quite easy to look and see that air traffic growth is wiping out every single improvement that we get from any other decarbonisation measure. So if you look at the projections, fossil fuel use is going to grow from aviation over the next few years. It's not going down. And this is in the context of us needing to halve emissions by the end of the decade. So we're saying that we need to go in one direction, but in reality, we're flying in the completely opposite direction. This is incredibly worrying for aviation workers and for every member of our group. So really, you know, that's why we're really keen to actually dispel some of the myths, provide some of the technical expertise that can help people understand this. So very keen for the discussion today to help answer questions. Now and after, you know, we'll share my email and you can get in contact with our group if there's any real specific thing that you want help understanding, so that you can challenge it.
Fantastic. Thanks, Finlay. A great reminder there, I think, as well, that aviation isn't this homogeneous blob that is just emitting carbon emissions. It is made up by human beings who obviously inhabit this world that we live in as well, and obviously have different views and emotions about what that sector is doing. So I think that's an important thing to remember. It's something I remind myself of when I'm being a journalist as well. I mean, we're moving to the second half of the panel now and picking up on a few points that you've all made during your interventions. I guess maybe a question for all of you to kick off that's maybe a bit more conceptual or to the point. Do you think that flying can ever be sustainable? Given what we're doing at the moment, is it even possible that we can make this sector what it's claimed to be by a lot of airlines? I don't know if there's any of you that want to kick off with your thoughts on that. Finlay, you were last to arrive. Maybe you can get us started.
Yeah, no problem. You know, I think there's ways that we can fly beyond 2050 that don't involve the use of fossil fuels. I think after 2050, there'll still be is there a livable planet after that point is a really important question. And will we be using most of our resource and money to remove carbon from the atmosphere, and we won't have much to spend on other stuff? So I think we'll always need to be, I think for the next few decades, very careful about resource use and mindful of the fact that aviation, you know, even if it's battery electric, even if it's electrofuels or green hydrogen, will be using far more energy than if you travel by electric coach or train to somewhere a bit closer. So I think there'll always be that issue. I think there is a positive future for air travel where we do fly as efficiently as possible and use as little resource as possible. But the reality of the timescales of the industry, so it takes 15 to 20 years to design and develop a new aircraft and to certify it, and then another 10, 20 years to productionize it, roll it out so that you can actually get the fleet out there. We need to buy that time to be able to do that, which means we need to moderate how much we fly in the short term to preserve our ability to be able to fly in the long run.
Mm-hmm. Well, what's your view on this, Aaron? You put your hand up just as I asked you. Perfect. I mean, there was some news, I think, this week or last week about this new startup company, you know, building a model of an electric plane that they want to build. All very exciting. But as Finlay said, you know, this is the beginning of their journey. It's not going to be in the skies anytime soon. Yeah, what's your view on, can aviation be sustainable ever?
Yeah, exactly. Thanks. So actually, I wanted to jump in about what Finlay was just saying. Yeah, exactly. It's super important to keep in mind that in the next 10, 20 years, this is not going to be possible to clean up aviation. But once we get to that point of already starting to use new technologies that are a bit cleaner, I think it's important to make the point about the fact that not all alternative fuels are equal. So it's not the same to talk about biofuels or synthetic fuels. From Transparent Environment, we believe that biofuels are not the best way to go because actually they are competing with feedstocks and they are contributing to deforestation. So it's also important the choices that the aviation industry are making, choices that they are making, and what technologies they are investing on is super important also for the sustainability's sake, if that ever happens.
Mm-hmm. Derek, your view on this?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, and sustainable, I guess, can mean different things. I guess looking big picture, if we look at scenarios for limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees and getting to net zero emissions by the middle of the century, aviation is one of those what's called hard to abate sectors, right? So there are some sectors like electricity production where it's a big challenge, but it's relatively easy. We can envision with technologies today how to decarbonize electricity completely. Aviation, it's not clear how we get there. It's going to have to be a mix of different things. And for example, the International Energy Administration has developed scenarios, kind of pathways on how we can get to 1.5 degrees or stay below 1.5 degrees. And in those scenarios, it's not that flying is eliminated completely, right? So they're not envisioning that we need to just stop flying everywhere, but they do, in addition to looking at adoption of alternative aviation fuels, improving airline efficiency, aircraft efficiency and everything else. There's a big component of it that's just behavioral, what they refer to as behavioral change, right? So people need to fly less. So what is sustainable aviation? I think it means flying less than we otherwise would. And certainly from a consumer perspective, contemplating whether you really need to take that flight or whether there are alternative options available because, we need to simply reduce the amount that we fly to have a realistic chance of meeting our goals.
Alternatives or alternates is quickly becoming, I think, the word we've used most in this this panel so far. We need alternatives in order to offer people a way to actually fly less. I guess I wanted to ask another question to whoever has a thought on this, is that obviously when it comes to anything in the energy transition, the big question is, well, who pays for it? And some airlines have actually decided that it's passengers that should pay for green levies and to pay extra when they buy their tickets. I wondered if anyone has a view on whether or not this is a fair way to approach this subject, whether or not this is what you think airlines should be doing, and whether you think other airlines will follow that lead. Maybe Hiska, do you have a view on this with green levies for passengers? Is this a positive step or a big no-no for you?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we all know that aviation is exempted from many taxes, like for example, the kerosene tax. And I think it's very important to get that on table. And I am worried that this is being used as an excuse not to get the real levies that we need. So it's used as an instrument in the lobby. And that is something that worries me. I think it would be really good also to include measures that are more fair, like for example, to introduce a frequent flyer levy, so that those people who fly the most or people who fly business class, that they are the ones who pay the extra tax or most tax, because they are causing the most damage. And then you don't harm everyone, but in particular those that cause the most emissions.
And I mean, just on how that tax you think should come about, Hiska, is this something that the EU really needs to get serious about now, or are we going to have to rely on sort of a coalition of progressive countries saying that this is something we're going to do and flights between those countries will be taxed? How do you think that would work?
Yeah, I think what you see right now is that you have, like, in the end, you need, like, of course, like international regulation and international agreement, but you don't get to international agreement if you don't have a few countries that take the lead. So you need a few countries that are that set the example and that show how it should be and show how it works. And that creates the new norm in which it becomes possible to talk about it and to implement it. So we need countries to be the front runner.
Finlay, maybe your view on what concerned people still working for the aviation industry think about this kind of issue. Is this something that your members, your colleagues sort of push for? Is that there should be more taxes on the industry rather than on the people you're trying to get places? Where do you kind of stand on that?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that's the same thing. You tax an airline, they will have to pass the cost on to the consumer. They can eat into the profits so far, but they'll need to remain profitable as a company. So the cost of flights will go up with the cost of fuel or additional charges. But we say this is inevitable. It really is. The reason it's inevitable is if you look at the cost of, in the future, you will need to ramp down subsidies for fossil fuel. So the cost of fossil jet fuel will go up. We'll also need, if you're still burning fossil fuel in 10, 15 years' time, we'll need to re-sequester that from the air. That's going to be incredibly expensive. And then your alternatives, which are some advanced biofuels, but expensive, or electrofuels or hydrogen, are all cost hundreds of dollars per ton of CO2 to abate. So, and just, so let's just say you're looking at $300, $400 or euros per ton. At the moment, the effective price is it's down close below $10, right? So it's a factor of tens or hundreds off. We're so far off the real cost. And we are really worried that we continue in this low unpriced state for the next 10 years, and then it becomes impossible to continue. And we need to smack a very high price on. That price will be passed on to consumers, and suddenly very few people will be able to fly. And that's what we're talking about, we're concerned around. So because we see this inevitable brick wall approaching that we're flying towards, we're really strongly advocating for a tax that is phased in on a yearly basis, increase to phase this in. What that will do is it will give us some time to adapt as an industry, and to try and scale some of those technologies. So the worst thing you can do is not pay for anything for 10 years, and then you suddenly need it, and it takes 10 years to build one of these facilities, and then you can't fly at all. So it seems very counterintuitive that aviation workers would be in favor of more regulations on their industry. But what I'm trying to get across is that we're actually really want the governments to regulate us, because without that, we fear that there might be no aviation industry left, or one that's massively reduced, and it's through disaster rather than late disaster rather than early design.
Maybe a question for you, Clémence, on the rules that underpin all of this. Consumer rules, extremely important. There are new EU rules coming into force next year about green claims and the things that we're talking about today. They effectively ban climate-related claims if they're based on offsetting, as we've discussed already, but they don't apply at company level. So, in your view, do we need a full ban on this kind of thing to just get it out of our systems and so we can move on from it? What's your view on it?
So, thanks for the question. First, about the new rules on promoting carbon offsetting. What has happened, so we still have the prohibition of misleading claims, right? And then the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive also hold a specific blacklist of practices which are prohibited under all circumstances. And this has now been amended to include carbon neutrality or similar claims if they are based on offsetting. And the directive actually explains that this is to be prohibited because emissions and the benefits or the effects of carbon credits are not equivalent. So it's essentially like following following the research. This prohibition focuses on product-related claims, but it doesn't mean that company-related carbon neutrality claims are now legal, because the general ban on misleading marketing claims still applies. And my take is that what has now been decided by multiple courts around Europe makes it very clear that carbon neutrality claims that are based on carbon credits are factually incorrect and therefore misleading. Maybe, I mean, the broader question is about, so this is just one type of like greenwashing practice. The broader question is about advertising from industries which systematically use greenwashing. And Hiske already described how you then typically see how just like a word changes after a complaint has been made, or like there's like a new variation of the advertising, but the type of greenwashing communication stays the same. And I think that there is a real good case to be made that for these industries that engage in these practices, a general ban, advertising ban following the tobacco example is in order.
And just quickly, Clemence, those new rules that you mentioned, do you think that they're kind of fit for purpose now and we're in a good place, or do you think that further closing of loopholes and making them stronger is something that the European Commission or regulators should look at? What's your take on the rules? Are they good?
Sorry, was that directed at me?
Yes, it was. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, just to follow up on what you said, basically.
Well, I feel that there's attention to the problem, although the attention has been there already for a while. And I think that like this, in some ways, this like careful approach that is not appropriate anymore. I think there is a good argument to be made that certain types of industries, they should just not be allowed to communicate to consumers anymore, just because they have this history of deception.
Mm-hmm. I said that I'd come back to this, Hiske, and here we are. I think it was this week or last week, the news that The Hague became the first city in the world, I believe, to ban fossil fuel advertising, essentially. So petrol and diesel cars, cruise ships, aviation can't be advertised in the streets of The Hague. What's your take on that? Is that something that you think should be rolled out everywhere? I mean, obviously, there's a link with what we're talking about here, obviously, that the aviation industry is using fossil fuel, and as we've said, it will continue to do so for quite a while yet. Yeah, do you think that's a policy that should be rolled out everywhere?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I think when we were confronted with climate change, and when we knew what was coming at us, I think the first measure that we should have taken is banning these kind of ads, because it doesn't make sense to try to get more people on planes or get more people like buying cars if you know that these things are polluting the world and like leading to emissions and causing climate change. So it's such a basic step with like stopping these advertisements. They should have been banned already, but I think this is a very good step. In The Hague, it's like implemented in the law, so it's really like they can't be there in a local law, so it can't be there as of the 1st of January. And I think it's like we need to have this in every city, in every country, in the entire European Union, but also like in the world. We don't have advertisements for tobacco any longer, or at least in most places. Let's do this for the thing that is like harming everyone in this world.
Mm-hmm. And maybe just to follow up on this with Aaron and Finlay, this idea of banning fossil fuel ads, which would include the airline industry. Is it fair to say that like the alternative solutions that we've mentioned about developing battery electric aircraft, hydrogen, alternative fuels that can be called sustainable, does that not require advertising to the public so they'll use these services? Is that fair to say, or what's your view on that point? I know no one will use them. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe just kind of start. So I will pick up on something that I think it was Clemens who said it before. So any emission that you are adding makes zero emissions impossible. So according to me, claims about making aviation net zero should be banned. So the thing is that I don't think they should continue to do this. And in any case, considering the fact that we have to reduce in the short term, and also if you think about the ICCT report, which you may know is the UN body for the climate change, they are asking for very quick and urgent cuts on emissions. And if you are doing marketing or publicity to actually increase the demand of aviation, is not actually going into the pathway of the UN. So I would say no to these claims.
And Finlay, did you have anything to add? Yeah, on that point?
Yeah, I think it's fair. I mean, the thing that is worth understanding, we talk about these fuels, but aviation is 99.99% fueled by fossil fuels, and that's not going to change anytime soon. So you're basically flying around in a massive oil tanker, burning fossil fuel at a faster rate than you could do any other way, apart from get into a space rocket and go into outer space, right? So I personally can see the can see the merit in that, and as I said, it's resource intensive, even if it's low operational emissions. The only thing I'll add is I think there's some particularly bad airline marketing processes and practices that we should be focusing on. There's very little focus on frequent flyer programs, air miles schemes, and these are a major driver of long-haul air travel, long-haul leisure, and premium seats. And we know, looking at the data, that it's a tiny minority of frequent flyers that blow the majority of the budget for aviation. It's not, even in a country like the UK, where we fly more than average, half the population don't fly. And then the majority of those who do fly once or twice, and they don't fly very far. So there's a small minority, it's like a few percent, that are responsible for the bulk. And that activity is being accelerated by these reward cards linked to credit cards. And yeah, I think it's very problematic. If anyone is looking at any cases to do with trying to reform that and try and limit those, I'd be very happy to help, because I think we need to tackle those.
Well, we can all be in contact after the event. We'll all be sharing a recording of the event as well, so people can look back on any questions that you found particularly interesting, of course. There was a point that I wanted to raise with you, Derek, that you, I think, made in your first intervention about people, passengers not really knowing the difference between climate neutrality, zero emissions, net zero, and so on. Do you think that it's up to airlines have a responsibility in that case to be the ones educating people and clearly explaining, if they are offering a climate neutral option, what that is, and that to be explicitly described? Or is it more up to, I suppose, people like me in the media to explain it to them properly, or for education to do that job? Well, I guess my question is, where does the responsibility lie, and how much responsibility do airlines have when they are offering these kind of schemes?
Yeah, I guess my take on that, and I'm not a consumer protection law expert by any means, but I would say, if you're going to represent, a product as being environmentally friendly in some way, you need to explain clearly what you mean by that and on what terms. And so I think it is, and it's, kind of greenwashing or intention aside, that the main issue here from my perspective is avoiding these unintended consequences, or it's sometimes called a perverse outcome, where you're actually encouraging greater demand for something that is not sustainable, because you're not fully representing the reality behind what we're talking about with a carbon neutrality claim, for example. It is not the same as flying completely zero emissions using, I don't know, synthetic electro fuels or something like that, if we're looking out into the future. And so, yeah, if you're going to make that representation, I think it's up to the entity making that claim to educate consumers about what exactly it means. And I would say, the cleanest way to represent it is to say, look, flying has an impact. If you also want to make a contribution to some things that may actually be helping to mitigate climate change, in addition to flying, say, if you decided you're going to fly, then great, you can make that contribution. But making the kind of connection between those two and saying this is equivalent can be problematic in terms of, again, the unintended consequence of that.
We're obviously talking about aviation today, that's our focus, but I think a lot of the issues that we are talking about apply to other sectors as well. I wanted to maybe get some of your takes on whether or not aviation is by far the worst offender here in terms of environmental enforcement not being really enforced that much, or what other industries are also to blame, I suppose. I mean, Aaron, transport and environment covers everything beyond aviation as well. Are there any other examples that we could sort of highlight about who the poor performers are in a way?
Well, the truth is that the aviation industry is the most climate intensive way of transport. So it's actually the sector of the transport sector that is increasing the most in terms of emissions and the quickest. So that's why for us it's super important to address aviation very urgently. And actually from the Travel Smart campaign, as I mentioned before, we target specifically business travel because we think that is an easy way to actually tackle the demand side of the behavioral change. Also because during the pandemic, we actually learned that many of the meetings that we were doing abroad, we could have done it actually online, like we are doing today with this webinar. Mm-hmm. So there's many things that we can do about reducing aviation demand. But what I can say about the different ways of transport is that aviation one is the one that should be tackled the first.
Mm-hmm. And Hiska, maybe what's your view on this? Should we just be focused on aviation? Is there someone else? We said about The Hague banning all fossil fuel advertising, and that's not just aviation, of course. What's your view on this?
Yeah, so one of the industries that we are involved in right now is the cruises. So we are doing complaints at the advertising watchdog against MSC Cruises, who has a slogan, cruising the blue in a green way, and a responsible way of cruising to the future. And I think this is again similar to the aviation industry. It's a growing industry. The ships are becoming bigger and bigger. They're becoming more and more ships, and they are trying to sell this to consumers that are very aware of climate change and all the issues aligned to it, that they want to have responsible way of transport, and they are being lured into believing that cruising is a green activity. So I think this is just as important as fighting greenwashing in the aviation industry.
Mm-hmm. I can actually see a cruise ship from my window right now, and I can't wait for the new rules at EU level to come in where they aren't allowed to have the smokestacks running when they're at port, because it spoils the view and ruins people's health. So just a personal take on that. Finlay, got your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say this is one talking point that's used as a misdirection by my industry, and it's one that aviation workers hear, and it kind of, I sound very concerned and quite anxious about my sector. There's some people that kind of feel like it's all under control because they're seeing these same adverts that consumers are seeing. And one classic talking point is aviation is only 2% or 2 or 3% of CO2. And now it's actually 6% of total global warming because there's other things. It's not just carbon, but even 6% might seem small to people. And the problem is there is only 20,000 commercial airlines in the world, but there's like more than 1.5 billion cars. So of course, road transport is bigger, but it's because billions of people are in some way benefiting from it, or at least utilizing it. Whereas air travel, it's a small number of people, and often, as I said, it's frequent flyers that are using it again and again. It's not well distributed, so it's really just a trick of maths, but it's a very effective trick that the industry uses. And obviously, private jets are 10 times more carbon intensive again, but they look like an even smaller amount. I could go outside and burn a barrel of oil in my garden, it'd be 0.0001, but that doesn't mean that it's a very environmentally damaging thing to do. So I think there's a lot of deflection. And then also, we do need to decarbonize ground transport and heating, but the average person doesn't have much money to fit insulation, fit a heat pump, get an electric car. So we need government support for those things to help low-income groups. Where are we going to get that money from? Well, probably it makes sense to tax a high carbon, high income activity, right? But we're not doing those policies because we're being distracted by the greenwash. So that's just like how this system works and why it's really important to target the marketing.
Thanks to all of you for answering my questions. We're going to move over to the audience's questions now, because there's quite a few of them in the chat. Thank you everyone for posing one. We'll try to get through as many as possible, but no promises that we'll have enough time to do that. There's one that caught my eye straight away, and it's from Anne White. And she asks, how are companies in the UK or other jurisdictions that have strong anti-greenwashing legislation in place reacting to that legislation? I assume this is the EU rules that we were talking about, Clemence. Are they greenwashing less by practice? So yeah, does anyone have a view on what countries outside of the EU are doing, the UK in particular? Clemence, what's your view on that? Are they greenwashing less?
I'm sorry, I don't really know the answer to this question.
Anybody else have any views on it at all? Or not
really quick.
Yeah,
okay,
sure,
Johnny
sure.
can go because I've spoken a lot. Johnny, do you want to?
Johnny there? Or,
Yeah. Hi everyone. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
Great.
Here you're going to see you. Yeah.
I think my video, I can't turn it on at the moment, but anyway, so what we see sort of legally speaking across the landscape here is that there's been, it's certainly not the case that the industry kind of messaging playbook that we're seeing come out in this, in these court actions and this regulatory action is limited to the European Union. So there are similar court actions going on in various places around the world. The UK advertising regulator has proceeded against a number of airlines for this. The UK consumer protection regulator is doing a plank of work on green claims and may conceivably come to aviation. So I think the short answer is basically these practices are worldwide. The aviation is a sort of inherently international industry, and they attract the same legal risk kind of all over, because the legal norm about no misleading claims to consumers is a really common one. It exists in New Zealand, it exists in Australia, it exists in Canada, it exists all over the world. So I hope that answers that question, but in essence, I think the European coordinated regulatory action is probably now leading a wave that is much wider than Europe.
Thanks, Jonathan. I hope that answered your question, and thank you for posing it. There's another one here that I suppose caught my eye. To anyone that still has questions, please keep them coming in. It's from Maria Furtado. Her question is, IATA represents nearly 300 airlines globally, plays a significant role in developing industry standards and advocating on behalf of the aviation sector. The carbon offset program that it runs promotes and supports these practices. Therefore, shouldn't IATA be considered equally accountable? Yeah, I guess this is an idea of, well, who's responsible then? Is it the people behind the airlines as well? Is it just the airlines? Does anyone have a view on how broad this should go? Finlay, can hand up.
So for anyone that doesn't know, IATA is the International Aviation Air Transport Association. So they are an industry lobby group consisting of all of the airlines. There's also another group called ATAG that includes the aerospace manufacturers like Airbus, Boeing, and Rolls-Royce, who I worked for. Now, there's also fossil fuel industry companies that sit in these trade groups. And this kind of goes back to the previous question. I noticed that the energy companies, the fossil fuel companies, are the source of a lot of these talking points, of a lot of the messaging, and a lot of the strategic comms that airlines and aerospace manufacturers end up using, but often they weren't the ones to develop them. So I think the fossil fuel industry is very much involved. They see aviation growth as a way to continue extraction and continue increased demand, and therefore demand for their products. So they're very much involved with that. And yet, so I don't think, like, IATA is an industry group that is just all of the companies. Companies need to be regulated. They need to be regulated by governments, both at national level and internationally. So ideally, we would have aviation policies introduced in the COP process being discussed. Unfortunately, our industry has been very effective at lobbying to stop that happen. It's been put to a body called ICAO, International Commercial Aviation Organization. And all we've got is a very weak, very cheap carbon offsetting scheme that will not reduce emissions. So we've got a massive policy black hole at international level, and that's where most aviation emissions happen. We, of course, need national, and we need things like EU. It's really important, but we're desperate for some more regulations because they're very weak. So yeah, I think we need it both international level and bilateral, in absence of better international regulations.
Does anybody else have a view on this? On who should be responsible? Hiska, please, over to you.
Yeah, I think I think it's a very relevant point, and I think they are definitely equally accountable, and I would love to go after them, like, personally. But I think this is what they have. It's kind of like a playbook, and they've created a playbook for all the airlines to do their marketing. And I think their impact is very big. Like, for example, like they're lobbying on all kind of standards of being Paris aligned. I mean, they impact those standards as well. And they all do this to avoid the topic of reduction of flights, the number of flights. So it's a way to keep on growing. And this is why, like, the positive marketing of all the measures that they are making is so important to them. So I think it's very, I don't know how to make them accountable for this, but I think it's very important that we see that all these airlines are following the same book. And that this is why it's so important to regulate it.
Thanks, Hiska. Does anyone else have a view on this before I try and extract another question from our knowledgeable audience? No, you all seem to be happy. Okay. Yeah, this other one caught my eye from Sven Kluppel. He's a competition lawyer at NRF. Thank you for your question, Sven. Essentially, I think it gets to the point of, well, do you think that banning airline ads would inhibit beneficial competition between airlines to become more sustainable in a way, a race to the top or a flight to the top? Yeah, does anybody have a view on that? I think it goes into a little bit of what we spoke about before, but maybe just to clarify our views on this, would this kind of ad-led thing be beneficial or not? Jonathan, would you?
Thank you, and thank you, Sven, for your question. And I put a brief answer in the chat, but I'll just sort of expand on it slightly. I think what you're saying really drives at Hiska's point, the desperate need for coordinated regulatory action in this space. I mean, the signal sent by a judgment ought, in the way the legal system works, to result in legal compliance observing that line across the board. Unfortunately, that's not how the real world works, because essentially companies conclude they can get away with it still until they're sued personally. And that's why I think we need the coordinated regulatory action to set the level playing field on this issue, basically. The second thing I just wanted to underscore was that the sort of core point of the evidence here is that more climate-friendly flying that one airline may purport to be doing is effectively so minimal in actual environmental impact as to be immaterial. And that's why those claims are unsafe as a matter of consumer protection law, and that's why it makes sense to prohibit the whole. And what we've heard today is that that's going to remain the case for some time. So I would also just point to that key issue of exaggeration being the real risk in this. And others seem to be keen to weigh in, so I'll give way. Thank you.
Clemence, I noticed that you had your hand up first, so over to you.
Yeah, the point is really an interesting one. I think there's two parts to the, or my answer would have two parts. One aspect thereof is that currently, according to current rules, if airlines find a way to communicate about climate benefits of their products in a non-deceptive way, then they are free to do it. My finding of assessing existing communications by the airlines about climate benefits are that they are systematically deceptive. So that is one aspect. The other aspect is the discussion that we had about is it useful to think of a general ban on fossil advertising, specifically also about advertising by the aviation industry. This is then a political choice that if we see that there is systematic deception from an industry, then it makes sense to no longer rely on bit-by-bit enforcement driven by NGOs or consumers by regulators, but to draw a general line. And my take is that in the case of airline advertisement, that line is crossed, but it doesn't change the fact that currently existing communications about climate change by the advertising industry are systematically deceptive and therefore in any ways prohibited.
Mm-hmm. Systematically deceptive. I may have to use that, Clémence. Thank you for that good way of summing that up. Derek, you had your hand up next. What's your view on this?
Yeah, so I guess a couple of thoughts. I mean, apart from just the deception question, I think Sven raises a good question here, and it's along the theme of, you know, what I was talking about earlier, perhaps unintended consequences. Are we foregoing an opportunity here to maybe do more than we otherwise would, or have airlines do more than they otherwise would? But I guess I would step back a bit and kind of ask the question, like, is the way we want to get to sustainability through, you know, consumer choice? You know, this is sometimes referred to as consumer scapegoating. You know, essentially, it's putting the onus on consumers to drive the change we need when really what we need is systemic change. And it's a risk. It's like it's another kind of way that industries kind of say, you know, make it somebody else's problem. In this case, the consumers. And you know, I guess going back to what Johnny was alluding to, I think ideally we would have regulations that drive climate change mitigation measures of whatever sort across the industry, right? The airlines that may be getting tagged for greenwashing may not be the ones that are experiencing the greatest growth. We need to get to the industries that are maybe not being responsible. And I don't think encouraging more, like putting the onus on consumers, is necessarily going to get at those industries. So I think we need to reframe the question and maybe rethink a bit sort of how we get at the mitigation measures that we need. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Derek. Hiske, to round us off on this particular point, what's your view?
Yeah, the question reminded me of an advertisement that KLM put up just before the hearing of our case. And it was an advertisement for a trip to South Africa, because summers are getting cooler there and people could escape from the heat in Europe. So they could fly to South Africa in business class chairs. But those chairs were made from lighter material, so it would be better to be on these chairs. And I think this is like a very good example of how like an airline kind of like presents something as being more sustainable, but the consumers don't know all the information. They don't know how bad a business class chair is. They don't know how bad a long distance flight is for the climate, because they haven't been told. They are just hearing these chairs are good because they are lighter and this is good for you. And consumers don't have the knowledge to judge all this. They don't know what a real impact is for the climate. And I think that's why we have to be very careful with these kind of advertisements.
I think we've just got time for one or two more questions. There was one near the top that I'm just trying to find, and it's about, contrails. And the question is the following from Killian. Given the reduced scope of European contrail monitoring, reporting, and verification, is not mentioning contrails and other non-CO2 pollution from the aviation industry, should that be considered greenwashing? I suppose I'd add into this question as well, things like noise pollution, right? And if you live near an airport, is that not something that the airline should be adding to their declarations as well? Maybe that's a question for all of you or whoever wants to answer it. The non-CO2 impacts of aviation is not mentioned in them greenwashing as well. Is there a legal stance on this or a sort of responsibility the airlines have to make their passengers aware of this? Yeah, any views on this one? Johnny's got his hand up, Finley as well. Johnny, we'll go to you first. Okay.
Oh, well, I expect Finley will have the sort of detailed evidence at his fingertips. From a legal perspective, the basic problem with this one is if you're communicating about the environmental impact of a product or a business and you leave a huge part of it out, you're liable to be in trouble. And the non-CO2 impacts of aviation, something that the industry is very keen to not talk about or disclose or be transparent about, are a very large part of the impact. So if you think about this from another sort of analogous consumer perspective, if I was selling you a product that costs 10 euros and I told you that it costs 6 euros, but I left out the 4 euro surcharge, that would obviously be misleading. And in a sense, from the environmental impact, if you're communicating about the environmental impact and you commit that kind of sin of omission, then it attracts the same kind of problem. But Finley, over to you.
Yeah, it's really just to then the context around what Johnny was saying there. It's possible that an airline might be able to reduce its carbon emissions by 10% by 2030. And if you look at a lot of airlines, probably actually their carbon emissions are going up. But let's just say that they were on track to reduce by 10%. It might be that because they're flying more and they're producing more contrails, their overall impact has actually doubled. So when they're saying when we say we need to halve emissions by 2030, it's all warming impacts need to be halved. So if we're literally not talking about something that is producing 2/3 of our warming on an annual basis at the moment, then it's a big deception to consumer. But also from an industry perspective, it's the fastest way we can reduce our climate impact in the next few years. It would produce more jobs and a bunch of other things. So we are really shooting ourselves in the foot by not doing that. And that also kind of brings in the lobbying aspect, because an airline might look good, slightly better on CO2 on the same flight versus another one, but it might be involved in lobbying against the very policies we need to reduce emissions. And that's something that's not factored in as well.
Thanks, Finley. Yeah, if anyone out there in the audience as well has any other views on the non-CO2 impact of aviation, please do get in contact with me, because I've been trying to put together something on this for a while, whether it's an article or a podcast, and I'd be really interested to hear your views on it. So just bear that in mind. We've got time for one more question from the chat, and it's this one from James Beard at ECF. He says, sustainable aviation fuels have been defined in EU and UK legislation. Is that a credible defense for airlines to justify their use of SAFs in their marketing? And do we need to do more work to challenge the dominance of SAF-centric policy discourse? I think that's a good one. Yeah, if the EU and UK have defined these fuels and they're promoting them, then why shouldn't the aviation industry do the same? I guess would be the logic. Clemence, put your hand up. Over to you.
Maybe a quick, just a legal take on this. We can think of the concept of regulatory greenwashing, so that a regulatory authority is misleading, is also using misleading concepts. And I think what is important here is that just because a public authority is using misleading concepts, maybe even in its regulation, doesn't mean that from a consumer law perspective, these concepts are not, or these terms are not misleading. So that is, I think, really important to point out that even if sustainable aviation fuels are, like defined in regulation, doesn't mean that communicating about them as sustainable wouldn't conflict with existing rules that prohibit misleading communications.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else have any views on this particular one? Johnny, yeah, over to you.
Yeah, just to back up what Clement says, I mean, from a legal perspective, the existence of supply-side regulation about alternative fuels that uses that SAF phrase does not affect the application of consumer protection law, which, it's not an exemption. It doesn't exempt the application of consumer protection law, nor would it exempt the application of investor protection law, I expect. So the narrow answer is, legally speaking, no, but I think it speaks to a broader thing as well about the way that when we have types of communication that are regulated, like selling communication to consumers, which is the reason we're here today, we see these issues picked up. Where we don't have that regulation, like in lobbying spaces, in discussions amongst institutions and sort of scientific and sort of policy pieces, we see these issues, these things take hold and start to have the effect that they're designed to have, which is to create a sort of image of a solution that is not quite what it actually is when you look at the evidence. So that really underscores for me the need to have a better regulatory approach to what are solutions in a climate context and what are not. And that really goes again to the example that we talked about fossil fuel advertising prohibitions. You look at the tobacco regulation, it prohibits lobbying as well. It provides information, it defines things, and it also provides lots of public engagement about these subjects. That's the kind of demand reduction approach that is sorely missing in this space.
Fantastic. Does anybody else have any views on this one before I wrap up this event? Because unfortunately, we have run out of time, and I think we run out of questions in the chat. Nobody? James says thanks.
I was just going
to over to you, Finlay.
I was just going to mention, like, governments use it because it's a convenient term, because it's what industry uses. It's the industry that came up with the term. So it's not like something government produced and the industry are using it. It's the other way around. So I think it speaks to the fact we might need to change our language amongst policymakers, as James pointed out in his question.
Great point. Great point to finish up, actually. Well, it just leaves for me to say thank you to all five of you for your great views here. Well, all of you here. There isn't just five. Johnny's there as well. Hi, Johnny. If any of the people in the audience have any follow-up questions, I'm sure that our knowledgeable experts would be happy to engage with you in whatever communication way that they choose. I think that BEUC will be sending out some sort of post-event pack with the recording, so you'll be able to get in contact via that. And I'd like to turn the floor over now to Annabelle Arias from SECU. I always struggle with acronyms, Annabelle, so I hope I pronounced that one right. You're one of the 23 BEUC members who were involved in the case that we were talking about today. So you're well placed to, I think, wrap up everything we've been talking about here. So I'll hand the floor over to you, Annabelle.
Okay, thank you, Sam, and thank you, BEUC, for letting us close today's discussion. It was an insightful debate, and I'd like to briefly reflect on some key points. So, as we face the urgent challenges of climate change and its severe ecosocial impacts, consumers are eager to adapt their lifestyle to support this ecological transition. However, large companies and corporations are taking advantage of this mobilization to greenwash these products without actually changing their production methods or internal policies. Greenwashing, which originally operated exclusively in the area of energy, has, as we know, spread to all areas of consumption, thus slowing down the change in the production and consumption model. In fact, according to the Eurobarometer, while 57% of consumers in the EU are receptive to green claims, 44% are skeptical of the environmental information they receive. As we have been discussing today, this is a significant obstacle to the ecological transition and undermines consumer rights. It's important to highlight that the lack of transparency or false green claims prevents consumers from making sustainable choices because they don't have access to accurate information. The overload of ads about sustainable products can make people think everything is changing and that most companies are improving their production model, which, as we know, is not true. When consumers realize they have been misled, they lose trust and feel unprotected by institutions and governments, which seem to support business over people and the environment. In that sense, the aviation sector plays a key role in the transition because it currently accounts for 2% of global carbon emissions. Moreover, other emissions from the aviation sector contribute to 6% of the overall impact on global warming. So today we heard from various experts address the impact of airlines and the weakness of certain advertising slogans. Consumers need to be informed about this reality and the right to accurate information must be protected. Therefore, we hope that following the CPC investigation, authorities will send a clear message to the airlines and the aviation sector. It is essential that green claims are supported by sound scientific evidence and misleading claims will not be tolerated. As it was explained by the speakers today, even if airlines invest in climate protection projects, consumers must understand that this doesn't fully offset flight emissions. In our opinion, airlines need to be honest that flying is not sustainable now and won't be in the near future. So we, as consumer organizations and civil society, will continue to work on this issue as a priority, helping consumers and authorities to identify and stop greenwashing. So thank you all, and I now hand the floor again to Sam.
Thanks, Annabelle. Fantastic. Well, I hope everyone watching still, your interest has been piqued in this incredibly important issue, a really crucial time for it as well. I'm sure BEUC, ClientEarth, and all the other organizations involved with this will keep up their good work and keep us all posted on how it goes. The importance of it, I think, is pretty clear from the event that we've just held. It just leaves for me to say thank you to Johnny, to Pauline, to our panelists, Derek, Clemens, Finley, Hiska, and Erin, and to you, Annabelle, as well, for your closing remarks, and to everyone for taking part. A recording will be made available if you'd like to go back and check, or to send to your friends so they can enjoy it as well. And that's it. A good afternoon to all of you, and thank you for participating.